I got an investment opportunity for you. But here's the deal. You're going to invest in companies run by these founders. They've never run a business before. They're not really even sure what business they're in. They have no business plan. They think cold calling literally is the right way to grow their companies. They seem to have a chip on their shoulder about something, and they disdain how everyone else does things. They don't have a college degree from a top university, and they're fairly young. They're in their late 30s. Would you invest in any one of these founders? Well, I have good news and bad news. The bad news is they won't take your money because they decided to bootstrap their company. The good news is they've mastered growing a company quickly without having to raise any outside capital, what I call a bootstrap fast growth company, or a BFG. And they've mastered what I call boot scaling, which is growing much faster than your competitors, your market, without having to raise external capital and selling your business and selling your soul to outside investors. And no offense to Reid Hoffman, but it's the opposite of blitz scaling, which is achieving massive scale by raising a lot of money and hiring a lot of people. It's completely the opposite. So you get to keep control of your company. So to echo what Verne said about the research, this took me 2.5 years. And what I did is, and I was really inspired by Jim Collins' Good to Great book, and I wanted to do the same thing for privately owned bootstrap companies. So I looked at the Inc. 5000 over a 7-year period from 2015 to 2022. And that was about 30,000 unique companies in that time frame. And I filtered them by companies that doubled revenues every year for at least 4 consecutive years running. Think about that concept. That's a really hard thing to do. So that took the number of 30,000 companies down to 386. I then wanted to separate out the companies that did that by raising growth capital. So using a lot of public sources like CB Insights and PitchBook data, I eliminated the ones that we could tell achieved that growth by raising outside capital. So that took the number of 386 down to 324. So effectively the top 1% of 30,000 companies of the Inc. 5000 over that period. Fortunately, it represented almost every kind of business, B2B, B2C, government contracting, franchises, product companies, service companies, you name it. And that's what this research was all based on. To give you a little bit more context about the type of companies, the revenue ranges were from $8 million to $2 billion, some very large companies in this mix, with the average revenue of around $78 million per year. Average growth of a year-over-year basis was 163%. Again, think about that concept. You're doubling your business every single year on a bootstrap basis. Average number of employees was 260, and the average age of the company was 13 years. Now, I want to make one point here, and that is if you're an existing business, all of the insights in this book are going to be completely relevant to you. In fact, it's really not appropriate for startup companies. It's for existing businesses and things that you can do to scale up faster. The founders of these companies, on average, started their companies at 34. They're about 42 years old right now. As I mentioned, virtually none of them went to a prestigious college. Most of them were first-time founders, which is pretty extraordinary. There's a couple that had started businesses before, but most of them, this was kind of their first run at the game. They all successfully guided their businesses through COVID, which was a very difficult time. And as you might imagine, and much to Verne's delight, they're voracious readers and they're continuous learners. And interestingly enough, I asked them all what the #1 most influential book that they read was. And I'm sorry, Verne, it was not Scaling Up or Mastering the Rockefeller Habits. It was Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, which is just kind of mind-blowing. And here's some big picture things that I learned. I mentioned they didn't have a business plan. So the only one that I talked to, I had over 85 interviews of the CEOs and their leaders, in addition to all the research we did around these 324 companies, is the only one that had a real business plan was a guy who just graduated with his MBA and he thought he should do that. So what they did instead is they really got intimate with their market. They figured out what their customers needed. They knew whatever was going to go on a business plan from a financials perspective or how they were going to go to market was just kind of made up, and they really just needed to go figure it out. What Silicon Valley really talks about product market fit, right? Finding that perfect product market fit. Average revenue was 78 million, as I mentioned. You would expect that it's a pretty good sized company. Their operations would be running very efficiently. I found completely the opposite. They were kind of messy. And I think the reason is because when you're doubling every year, right? things changing so rapidly, your team, your customer base, everything internally. So they were a little bit messy. Interestingly enough, they all had a single primary method of acquiring customers. And I'm an ERP guy. I work for SAP, I work for IBM, and I kind of focused on processes and standard operating procedures and systems, and none of them really had that until they got to much, much larger scale. They didn't raise the capital because they didn't think that they could. They didn't think it was an option to them. It wasn't necessarily that they picked wanting to be a bootstrap company. One of the CEOs I spent time with tried to raise outside capital. She got 102 no's. And so she just figured, I'm done. Let's just go bootstrap this thing. And a lot more insights I'm going to share in just a second. So this is how the book is structured. And I riffed on Verne's 4 decisions framework. And so I've organized the book by team, customers, capital, strategic execution, and leadership. And I looked at the entire functional cycle in each one of those different functional areas. And I asked questions. I had over 230 questions, and then separated by each one of these. And those are the key insights that I'm going to share with you. So let's start with team. The number one thing that our BFGs did really, really well is thinking about what their culture was all about and really being able to describe it very, very cleanly so that anyone that wanted to go work for that company, and John just talked about this, and Verne talked about it at the top of the session, is they really understood and could describe what their culture was all about. They spent a fair bit of time talking about what does an ideal employee look like. As much time as many companies spend thinking about their ideal customer profile, they spent just as much time thinking about their ideal employee. They then focused all of their hiring processes around looking at outcome-based skills and culture fit. And they built the entire employee process all the way through onboarding that John talked about on those outcome-based skills, the values, and the culture fit, and created compelling job descriptions. And I'm going to give you an example in just a second of one that just absolutely nailed it. So Ginny Remedi is going to talk after me. She's the former CEO of IBM. I'm an IBMer, and I'm sorry to say that Ginny wouldn't have made it to any one of these companies because they didn't want to hire experienced hires. They didn't think that they were a good culture fit for these companies. So they built the entire process around culture fit, competency, skills, and then job outcomes, very specifically. And then they did a really nice job of creating an employee benefits package that they did on a very, very low cost way, right? These are bootstrap companies. So they had to figure out how to compete with big companies.
Oh yeah, you can stay to be sure this. Yeah, be sure you get on.
So let me give you an example of one of the companies, Pendo. So they're a software company that they are trying to improve the world's experience around software. And I'm gonna go ahead and just read this because it's pretty compelling. So Pendo culture combines the thrill of a startup with the reassurance of grown-up resources. And at our core, we're a team of resourceful individuals who love to question everything. But where some companies may fail to focus that energetic, rebellious streak, Pendozers channel our collective bias to act in innovation, colorful celebrations, and a maniacal focus on our customers. Now, you know what this company is all about. If you're a top performer and you're a rock star that John talked about, and you're thinking about a new job, you know exactly whether this is a good fit for you. Now, we looked at another company that's in their market space, and this is what's on their website for applicants that are thinking about coming to work for them, being part of a community of like-minded professionals, looking for exceptional career opportunities and growth. We're hyper-focused on creating value-added experiences. I mean, come on, it doesn't say anything. So if you're a top performer, you're going to go work for this company, or going to go work for this company. That's what the BFGs did a really good job of. So now let's shift to the customer piece. Looking at marketing, sales, and service from demand creation and capture all the way through to co-innovation. The BFGs really didn't do any traditional marketing activities like creating customer avatars. They didn't do that. They didn't feel like there was a need. They focused on jobs to be done and really the problems that their customers were trying to solve that they could solve in a very unique way. They picked one growth lever to master, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in just a second. And they mastered and refined every step of the customer journey until they made it predictable. One of the companies I talked to called Retail Service Systems actually patented their sales process, and they have a 90% close rate. By the time that a customer responds to one of their ads, all the way through to buying their products, 90% close rate. Think about that concept if you can apply that to your business, because they mastered and refined and measured every single step of that journey. These companies also did a phenomenal job of creating and fostering a community. And I'm going to give you an example of a community-driven company in just a second. They doubled down on what made them unique, even if it was completely counterintuitive to the way that the industry worked. I'm going to give you an example of that. Some of the companies I found really interesting were way more transparent than I think most people would be comfortable with. When they would talk to a prospect, they would start with all the things that were wrong about why that customer should not do business with them, because they wanted to make sure that they attracted the right kind of customer to their business. So they were very transparent and honest, and it built a lot of trust with the customer base. And finally, on the customer side, a lot of these companies of the BFGs co-innovated with their customers. So they built products and services right alongside with input from their customers, which, as you might imagine, they had an incredible success rate of getting into market because they already knew what the customer wanted. Now, this is a company called ClickFunnels. ClickFunnels is one of the fastest companies to get to 100 million in ARR, annual recurring revenue, on a bootstrap basis. They did it incredibly fast. One of the secrets that they used was creating this community. So they have a community called funnel hackers. These funnel hackers, they went so far as they created a manifesto for the funnel hacker community. And one of the things that I looked at when I kind of keyed in on creating community is I looked for images on the web of people that actually tattooed the logo of the company on their skin. I can tell you there are a lot of funnel hackers that have tattooed ClickFunnels somewhere on their body. It's pretty incredible. Farm Girl Flowers. The CEO is female with a completely female-led team. It's an incredible company. They grew to over 100 million by doing something crazy. So they're up against a male-dominated, very large floral industry, right? So the way they went to market is they wouldn't let you pick the flowers that you bought for yourself or your friend. They curated them for you. Her and her team created all of the packaging, and they picked the flowers for you. So when you bought a Farm Girl Flowers package, you didn't get the choice of what you wanted. They said, this is what you're going to get. And they just blew everybody else away. Incredibly successful. Now let's shift to the capital section. So I said they're bootstrapped, so obviously they're going to tightly manage their cash, right? But what they did uniquely is they really leaned into this bootstrap culture. From the time that a prospective applicant came in to be hired, they talked about the fact that they are a bootstrap company, cash is tight. If they're not comfortable with that, they're not a good fit in the company. And so what they did is they were able to create a culture of cash awareness. So everybody was focused on things that they could do individually to help the company save money and improve cash flow. Every one of these companies that I interviewed had pricing authority, meaning they were kind of at the premium end of their market. So if you think about it, you have to have the gross and net margins to be able to fund that kind of growth. As you know, growth consumes cash. And so you have to have enough profits in the business to be able to continue to fund that growth internally. Most of them, when they got to the point of they were ready to scale or they were ready to take advantage of acquisitive opportunities, they then found non-equity sources, very creative financial sources, whether it was term loans or lines of credit, to go take advantage of that scale. Interestingly enough, of everybody that I talked to that had established these lines of credit, none of them used it. They just had it as, an opportunity, a contingency plan if they needed it, but they all they were generating enough cash that they didn't need to do that. All of these companies that I talked to had a ton of money in the bank. None of the founders took that money out. They all reinvested back into the growth to help continue to scale up the company faster and drive up their enterprise value. Now, Verne talks about cash conversion cycle in his books, and I'm not going to get into a description of what it means, but the analysis that we did was the average cash conversion cycle for these companies was negative 5.2. And with a cash conversion cycle, negative is good, positive is bad. So they had 5.2 on average days of positive cash flow for the first couple of years, and then it got even better as they went along in years after that. So finally, let's shift to strategic execution. So this is the operational side of the house. So one of the things that a couple of the companies did is they really figured out how to create their own luck. So one of the companies we talked to is called Riva Solutions. Riva is a federal contractor. And the CEO and the founder of Riva decided that when they were competing for these contracts, he wasn't going to go after the projects that had 20 and 30 competitors competing. They went after the projects where there were 5 competitors, where they could really distinguish themselves. So he really wanted to create his own luck and increase the odds of winning that business. None of these guys focused on their competitors. They figured out how to chart their own path. Advertise Purple's in the affiliate marketing business, and great story about the founder being at a conference of affiliate marketers, and he's talking to the big companies that are in this space, and they're talking about they have 30 enterprise clients or 20 enterprise clients, and he said, "This is ridiculous. Like, that's it." It was a phenomenal interview, and I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I thought that was so ridiculous." Now Advertise Purple has thousands of competitors because they chose their own path. He very specifically chose not to go down the path of the big competitors in the space. And now they are the big company. Apologize to Jim Collins and to Verne. It talks about the BHAG. I really expected to see these incredible mission statements and everybody's kind of focused on their BHAG and nobody had one. I was really pretty shocked. So nobody set out to, solve world hunger or solve world peace or anything else. They were focused on really getting intimate with their customers and being the best company in that particular market that they were in that they could possibly be. From an operational perspective, they all followed this pretty common path, which was enhance their operations, continue, and again, doubling every year, right? So many things are changing along the way. And they followed this sequence of enhancing operations, figuring out what to outsource. The finance function was outsourced for almost everybody from the beginning until they got much, much bigger. Then they figured out what to automate, and then they scaled from that point forward. But they all did this focused specifically on the customer experience to make sure they removed the inefficiencies and the friction from the customer experience. One of the companies that's over 100 million in revenue, I won't mention who it is, but they had a phenomenal brand and a phenomenal customer experience. They ran most of their financials on Google Sheets. I swear to God, I was blown away. But it didn't matter because they were focused on the customer experience and they grew to over $100 million doing that. When they did decide to invest in systems, they would pick systems that were a little farther out from what their scale was at that point. The example that was given to me was, if you're going to buy a shoe for your teenage son or teenage daughter, you don't buy a size 7 shoe that they are now. You buy the size 9 because they're going to outgrow the size 7 shoe really quickly. So they would always focus on buying something a little bit bigger than where they were. Perfect example of great strategic execution is DLP Capital. This is Don Wenner, who's the founder and CEO. They have been on the Inc. 5000 list for 11 years running. Don started out as one of the #1 real estate agents in the country. He's now has a business doing $5 billion assets under management as a real estate investment capital company with 18,000 units in their portfolio. And he was able to do that because they nailed the execution part of it. If you ever want a business to look at a perfect up and to the right curve, growth curve and profit curve, these guys mastered it. Phenomenal job. Finally, let's talk about what kind of leaders are able to pull off this extraordinary success. So the #1 thing that I discovered was most of them had a chip on their shoulder. And this came kind of through sideways conversations. They had something to prove to somebody. I've got some great personal stories in the book about some difficulties and some struggles that they had, that instead of using that as an excuse to not step up and be successful, they actually leaned into that. And it's what drove them and what drove their companies forward. They also learned how to grow themselves. One of the quotes in the book is, these companies could only grow as fast as their leaders. So they were continuous learners. They were voracious readers. They built external advisory boards. They put people around them that they could learn from. Because as I mentioned, most of these were first-time founders. So they didn't know what they didn't know, right? So they made sure that they were continuously learning. And finally, they knew when to fire themselves. So in the 2.5 years, 5 of the founders who were CEOs stepped down from being the CEO and brought in somebody else that they thought could take the business to the next level. In fact, the 6th one just announced this week that he's going to be stepping down as CEO. He's going to be the chairman of the board, and he's turning that over to somebody else that he thinks can now take the business to the next level. So they were very, very humble, not only just in terms of giving me all their time, but they were very self-aware and humble about the role that they played in the business and when it was time to kind of step away. So there's tons of a lot more key insights for each one of those sections in the book. I also have a ton of additional resources on how to actually do some of this stuff. So if you're interested, you can go to Scale Up Faster, get the book. There's my email, and you can follow us on any of our social channels as well.